Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC versus round number 2 overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into this one. Round 2 is technically accurate, but technically not accurate in the same vein. This is weekend 2 if you really want to be more broad. I just think round 2 will do better in the title. This is going to be lower bracket round number 1, upper bracket round 2, and lower bracket round 2, as well as winners finals covered in today's video. Everything that happened over the course of the 4 days of this past, super weekend, if you will, in the LEC will be covered in today's video. I'm very excited to get into everything. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from these games? What did you expect from these series? Did the teams live up to your expectations? Were you perhaps a little bit surprised by some of the outcomes? I'm very curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below on everything, but let's go ahead and get into things. A bit of an announcement at the start here. LPL is back, and so LPL English is back. We kicked off our playoffs last night with a couple of really big best of fives, but tonight I will actually be on the LPL English broadcast for one of the playoff best of fives in round number 1. Billy Gaming taking on Ninjas in Pajamas. If you are interested in checking out my live cast or just want to go watch some LPL English action and LPL action in general to see how those teams are doing, definitely check out the links in the description to both the YouTube and the Twitch. Catch us live on the Twitch if you really want to. All the VODs are of course posted on the YouTube. Highly recommend subscribing and following on both platforms so you can get the live and the VOD whenever you would like. And of course, the LPL's been great. I'll be on throughout the rest of the year, so definitely go ahead and check that out. But with the plugs out of the way at the start of the video, let's get into the content itself. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we'll be looking at the updated playoff bracket. 4 teams will remain by the end of this video. 2 teams playing off against each other in lower bracket round 3, 1 team kind of sitting in lower finals, hoping and praying that they can make sure they can move their way on, and 1 team that has guaranteed themselves top 2 and is 1 series away from being the LEC champion and qualifying for first stand at the beginning of the year. So we'll definitely have a pretty clear idea by the end of this video, but most of today is going to be spent talking about the games as per usual. So let's get into the action. We kicked it off not in lower bracket round number 1, but rather in upper bracket round number 2 with these best of 3s. If you win this series, you move on to winners finals. That is what is on the line. Of course, you know, losing this doesn't eliminate you. You still have your extra life in upper bracket, but it certainly makes things a lot more difficult to move forward. You do not want to be going down to lower bracket before winners finals in this particular format. So our first matchup, one that I was very intrigued by. Of course, all 4 of the top 4 teams have been good, but this was a matchup between the number 2 seeded Navi and the number 6 seeded Movistar KOI, where KOI are going to pick up the victory. They're going to get the 2-0 sweep, and they're going to look pretty darn good in doing so. They were absolutely the better team here today on the Rift. And I hate to say it, but that really shouldn't be all that surprising. I know people really like Navi, and I like Navi as well. I've continued to say that I think they're overperforming their talent level because they're the best drafting team in the region. They understand how to set up their own win conditions and typically put themselves in a spot to win in most scenarios, and I don't think that this series was entirely an exception to that, although I think like Dr. Mundo Misfortune, not necessarily something I would go for in the same way that I wouldn't go for Pantheon and Ivia on the other side. In most cases, LEC gets away with a lot because this really is the hands check region, but at the end of the day, KOI had better hands and they were able to play it better, and that's why they ended up winning. This was a massive mid and bot gap for Movistar KOI. Not that top and jungle played poorly. I think Mirwin and Elyoya were excellent, but Jojo, Supa, Alvaro, they were really the main characters for Movistar KOI in this series, and definitely the ones that you are going to be looking at when you talk about them moving forward now, punching their ticket to winners finals. So we can go ahead and talk about it. There's really not a ton to discuss in terms of how these games ended up going down. The only negative I can really give Movistar KOI is just that overall, I think they could have been a bit more consistent in terms of finishing these games quicker. I don't think they were the most clinical in terms of how they played their macro with the gold leads that they were able to generate, but really, I mean, that is such a nitpick because they were able to get such big leads in this series. Jojo Pune, for me, is going to get player of the series. If you wanted to give it to Alvaro, I have no exception on that. It should go to one of those 2. Supa was also excellent. I think Alvaro was better on the bot side in the bot lane here for Movistar KOI, so I think it should go to one of those 2. But Jojo going deathless throughout this series was just ridiculously good, and it just kind of proves with Movistar KOI what we already knew, which is that if Jojo is playing consistent, if he is on, if he is playing at his best, this team's basically unbeatable. In the LEC, they are the best team in the region when he is playing like that. He doesn't always play like that, and it's not always going to be the case that Jojo Pune can step up and just dominate lane in the way he was able to in both of these games, especially in game number 1 in a matchup where I don't think it's particularly favorable, I should say, for the Azir. You obviously want to see him be like a tad bit more consistent in those matchups, but again, like it's just ridiculous what he's able to do when it works. And 7-0 and 20, I do think, is indicative of his impact here. I don't even think he got egg popped on Anivia in game number 2. And for as critical as I am of Anivia as a champion, because I am critical, I understand the idea behind the counter pick to Rise. I've gone on rant after rant about this. I just don't think it works the way people want it to. I think it works in isolation, but I think, again, Anivia being so passive in terms of the way that she can skirmish in the mid game makes it more difficult to play around an aggressive jungler like a Pantheon. I just don't really like Pantheon unless you can move around the map with him, and Anivia really struggles to do that in the same way that even a Rise can match. Now, a lot of that's negated by the fact that the enemy team has a Dr. Mundo on the other side who also doesn't really want to skirmish in the mid game, so I guess all's well that ends well, but JoJo's still just making it worth it, right? If you're the better player, it doesn't really matter if you're in a matchup where you can't really shove and roam and play aggressive in the same kind of way. You're going to be able to generate pressure because you have a gold lead, and that's exactly what JoJo had in this series. Again, if he is on, if he is playing well, this team's going to be just fine. Same thing for Supa and Alvaro down on the bot side. These guys, I've talked about it before, have like very sneakily been some of the best playoff performers in the LEC over the past couple of years. I think they don't get enough credit for just being so good in Movistar KOI's playoff runs, and obviously Elyoya's been good in those runs. I think JoJo's had some really nice moments, but to me, Supa and Alvaro have really been kind of the dynamic bot lane that has stepped up consistently in best of 3s and best of 5s in this region, and they continue to do so. Alvaro got some criticism in the regular season for playing a lot of enchanters, not being super consistent on those picks. I think he was good, certainly had a couple of great games on Enchanters. Some of them weren't quite as good, but as we saw from the Rel, that's still going to be his signature thing. He's still going to be a big playmaker, especially in the later part of the game. You know, I wouldn't say that someone like Labrav is a good comparison because I think Alvaro is just a better player than Labrav, but that kind of play style where like you can find those angles in team fights more consistently than everybody else. If he can start to be more consistent on these Enchanters in the 2v2 in lane like he was with the Lulu in the Aphelios matchup, that is massive. He absolutely embarrassed Paris in terms of the way that this laning phase ended up going, and that's important for KOI. Supa obviously capitalized well. Elyoya has been an MVP caliber player all split long, and Mirwin has been fine on the top side. He's playing tanks pretty much exclusively now, but at the very least, he's playing them well, which is not something you could always say about Mirwin. So Movistar KOI moving on to winners finals is great. I mean, this is the expectation for this team. Top 2 is kind of what they're hoping for, and quite frankly, top 1 is super achievable for Movistar KOI if they can just lock in and continue to be consistent around their star players. But for Navi on the other side, this is probably more of a reality check for this team. 2 seed is obviously great, and you're happy that they did so well in the regular season. They had a couple of really big performances, and I think they proved that they're not just some flash in the pan, right? They are a top 4-ish team in the LEC, but the top 3 really are a bit separated right now, at least from my perspective, and Navi is just not a part of that, and I think we saw that when they actually went up against a team in the top 3 in a best of 3, not a best of 5, a best of 3 here. They just didn't have the skill, and they didn't really have the macro to be able to keep up. Again, I think they've been the best drafting team in the LEC, a region that I've criticized heavily for just being wrong on the meta read both last year and this year, and having struggles at international tournaments because of it. Navi, I think, has kind of been the exception, but they go back on their own word in game number 2 here. This is a really slow comp, and you're playing it with Misfortune. You're hoping and praying to get bot lane pressure in this one so you can move around with the Rise, but at the end of the day, where's Rise going to go if Bard is leaving bot lane? You have one winning lane, and it's the Misfortune, which Bard can't play for, and now all of a sudden you don't really have a way to play the mid game. This is just a really tough game to be able to win. I think the Dr. Mundo was just not aggressive enough for the Misfortune Bard on the bottom side. You need a jungler here who can fight in the early game, especially going into something like Pantheon. Just weren't necessarily afforded that, and I think Navi ended up really struggling because of that. Paris, I don't think played well. He's getting dead of the series. I think he had some individual bad plays, both on the Nautilus and on the Bard especially, but I mean, at the end of the day, this is a hard matchup for him to be able to play out. This is certainly not an easy comp. You have a lot of pressure and a lot of responsibility as the Bard to both make your Misfortune and your Dr. Mundo win throughout this game, which is tough. Again, Misfortune and Bard, not really the best chemistry in terms of the way that they want to play together down on the bot side. So for Navi, I think they kind of set themselves up into a bad position, but you still had to go out there and execute, which I don't think they necessarily did. Poby was certainly outclassed by JoJo in lane. This is one of those matchups that I was kind of excited to see because Poby has very sneakily been like a top 2 or 3 mid laner in the LEC over the course of this year. JoJo kind of saying, nah, shut that down. No. I am better. I am still the second best mid laner in the region behind Caps, and I think he proved that here today. Mainter really had nothing going on. Like, this Gnar was fine in lane, and he was awful in team fights. I think it's realistic to say that that was a big problem for the team as well. Relich couldn't really get going. Samdi obviously wasn't in a position to be able to carry. Navi just never really had the resources or the facilities to be able to play out these mid to late games like they wanted to, and that's just going to happen sometimes when you get outskilled, and that's really kind of the main thing for the LEC for me, is that these comps aren't necessarily super consistent with their drafts, and so it really just comes down to who executes better in the early game, and oftentimes that's just going to be the better team with better hands, right? And that's what this region incentivizes. So Navi hopefully can start to catch back up in that regard. I think they've been able to overcome some of their bad early games over the course of this year because they are so consistent in the mid game, but Movistar KOI was not going to let them get away with that here. They stall these games out. They get to the point where they can win with things like a Nivea, a Felios, or a Zir and Zahen in the late game of game number 1 as well. So really like the way they play. We know they're a very talented team. It's really just about execution for them, and top 1 still is definitely going to be the goal. But then moving on to our second series of upper bracket round 2, and this was the one everybody had their eyes on because this feels like a finals potential matchup this early on into the tournament. It was the number 1 seeded Corp taking on the number 7 seeded G2 Esports. And G2 are going to pick up the 2-0 win. They're going to punch their ticket to winners finals. And is it not just so predictable? It does not matter how bad this team does in best of ones. Quite frankly, it doesn't even matter how bad they look in the best of ones. Because as I've said throughout this entire split up until this point, this entire year, even going back to last year, this team doesn't really look good. They have like real flaws. Their bot lane doesn't really understand how to play either early or late. They kind of have to win in the mid game. Their top laner has just been losing in lane and putting them behind in scenarios. Skewmon has to do so much of the heavy lifting and play towards the early game, something he's still learning to do at a consistent level. And Caps really isn't a great early game player this year anyways. He's been very, very, very good in the mid and late game, but it's not really been a great laning phase kind of year for Caps up until this point. G2 like has real problems that they need to fix. None of that matters, man. It just all figures itself out once we go into the playoffs. I think part of that has to do with the fact that G2 just lock in a little bit more mentally. Of course, that is definitely going to be something that you can talk about, but even more so than that, I think Corp has shown an ability, a consistent ability to just underperform in these best of 3s and best of 5s. And it's a couple of players in particular in this one, but you get the picks that you want. You get a lot of the drafts that you've been able to win with, and you're just not playing the early games in the same kind of way. It's super frustrating. You're relying on some late game heroics, and sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And it just wasn't available here in this series where G2 were just the better team. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series is obviously Caps. I mean, he was absolutely styling on Yehu. This was not a particularly close mid lane matchup, which we'll talk about even more when we get to the Corp side, but this Taliyah Ryze, like, this is what G2 do at a really high level. It's what Caps does at a really high level. I know Baby Faker is like a meme, like Western Faker is, you know, something that people throw out, but I'm serious. Like, this guy has the same playstyle as modern Faker in terms of the way that they play and how you want to try and compare the way that they affect the map, where best case scenario for Caps, and I know this doesn't feel correct because he's the best player in the region, but best case scenario is he's a secondary carry on something like Taliyah or Ryze, opening up the map so that his jungler or his AD carry or his top laner can completely take over the game. That's where Caps has always been the most comfortable. He's just had to be a primary carry throughout a lot of his career because he's Caps. He's the best player on the team. But again, playstyle wise, I think he's always looked best in situations like this where his jungler is getting priority and his bot lane and top laner do have some gold and are playing aggressive carries that can take over in the later part of the game. I think it fits G2's playstyle, and man, he just looks dominant when he gets the chance to open up the map and be more of a roamer, be that shove and roam mid kind of player. So really love that for Caps. Obviously, he was significantly better than Yehu in the laning phase. That's more expected. We see the exact opposite in the drafts from these mid laners here, where the Taliyah and Ryze end up picking up the victory into the Azir and the Anivia, and obviously that's huge for G2. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about map control, and where Anivia can end up really struggling is just this idea where Ryze has so much more tempo and priority, and he's still going to do damage in the later part of the game. So credit to Caps. Thought he played well. Of course, a lot of credit goes to the rest of the team in that same vein. I think Broken Blade played probably his best series of the year up until this point. You know, Kana was somebody that obviously everybody had highly rated. I don't think he's been as good in 2026 as he was in 2025 so far. It's still very early on into the year, but Broken Blade definitely had an advantage in this series, and his damage was much more consistent than Kana's. Obviously, the Galio counterpick not necessarily working out in game number 2 into this hot pot comp, if you want, with Rumble and Jarvan. So overall, Broken Blade, you know, I don't know what to expect from him moving forward because he was so bad in the regular season, and quite frankly, he was so bad last year as well. Really just not getting a lot of his flaws hidden. I think that is a fair way to say it. Getting a lot of his flaws hidden by the fact that the rest of the team was playing super well. We'll see. I mean, this was a good series. He just needs to be able to keep it up. Skewmon continues to have a ton of responsibility on this team and to really do a lot of the little things for them that he's never going to get credit for. The only negative is that he couldn't land a smite to save his life. Yike was getting every 50-50 at the end of game number 2, and that could have been game losing for G2, but I think he played the fights great. Hansama and Labrov were solid. I don't really have major criticisms of them. I think that's best case scenario is that they're kind of fading into the background, and you hope that Caps and Skewmon can carry games for you because they were fine. I'm not trying to rag on them too much. Labrov had a couple of really nice moments on the Nico in game number 1. I just don't think they were like centralizing towards G2's success. This really just came down to who was going to execute better in the team fights in game number 2 especially, and that was G2. As for K-Corp, you got to feel bad for Yike. He basically lands every single 50-50 in this series, and they still end up losing. That's not really an ideal set of circumstances, but a lot of that comes down to the fact that Yike's mid game wasn't particularly good, and that the carries just weren't here today. The solo laners in particular, I think, really let the team down. Yehu, for me, dud of the series. I think it was very clear that there was one mid laner that was much better than the other, and that's going to be really tough to overcome in this modern meta, where mid and jungle are just the most important positions in the entire game at the current moment. When you're playing things like Azir and Anivia, you got to make sure that you can survive a lot of that early onslaught from things like Vi, Talia, or Jarvan Ryze that have so much tempo and priority around the map that can make plays super consistently. If you can survive that tempo, you can be theoretically fine, but this is why I always, disregard the, picks like this, and why I think it's more difficult to play these in the modern, in the modern game. Is that a fair way to say it? Like this year in particular, is because if the enemy team is good and proactive, then you don't really have a lot of counterplay opportunity, and Yehu was just constantly behind in terms of gold and tempo in this series. Now, again, part of that is just having to lean into Caps and not being as good as Caps, and that's just, it's part of the deal, right? Like, you're in the LEC, it's just how it goes, but Yehu was definitely the biggest problem for me and the biggest negative for K-Corp on the Rift today. Kana wasn't particularly good. He's really not been the same MVP version of himself that he was last year so far. He's definitely faded more into the background. His laning stats are good, but his impact on team fights is, like, noticeably worse. We'll see how that ends up aging. Hopefully he can start to get his form back. Busio also gets his signature Bard in this series and ends up underperforming. This team gets Ashe Seraphine, which has been super successful globally, basically in every region. They don't really find any success going into this strong 2v2 lane with the Corki Nami on the other side. You really want to punish Hans and Labrov early, and they just weren't strong enough to be able to do that. Like, these are players that have been stepping up, Busio in particular for this team, Yehu as well, who has been great this split, and they just weren't here today. And if that's going to happen, K-Corp's not really going to have a lot of chances for success. But the narrative, once again, for K-Corp is, are they going to choke it away in the playoffs? They did this last year when they missed Worlds, when they missed MSI, when everybody kind of projected them to go there. Is that going to happen again here? Not only for First Stand, but are they going to start generating a reputation of just not being able to do it in big moments? Hopefully that's not the case for them. We'll see as they head down to the lower bracket. But for G2, on the other side, they get themselves to winners finals against Movistar KOI. And it's G2, man. Like, and now that they're on fire, are they just the best team in the league again, despite the fact that they did not look good at all in the regular season? It's very possible. Certainly frustrating for people who watch every single game like myself, because it just feels like they're two entirely separate teams. But, G2 is the face of the LEC for a reason, and I think they proved that again here. Then moving on now to lower bracket round number 1. We're going back down to the first round so that we can get our first elimination series of the playoffs here. Remember, these are the teams that lost in upper bracket round 1 that we talked about last week. These are teams trying to survive that might have to make a gauntlet-style run on the lower bracket in order to get themselves even to Barcelona and into the top 4. And that starts off with the number 4-seeded team Heretics taking on the number 5-seeded GIANTX. Where GIANTX is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They're going to keep their playoff hopes alive and send Team Heretics packing. This was a very good series from GX. I think they were definitely the better of these two teams, despite the fact that they end up losing game number 2 here. I think it's clear in game 3, obviously, that they are better when they only give over 1 kill and overall just have a team comp that is basically unbeatable given the circumstances. And then they were definitely better in game 1. Game 2 was super back and forth, and they probably should have won that one anyways, so definitely feel like GX walk out of here feeling pretty confident that they are one of the better teams left, especially on the lower bracket side of the playoffs, and have a real shot of being able to make top 4 if everything ends up going right. As for Team Heretics on the other side, this is more the expected result. They obviously looked fantastic at the end of the regular season, where it felt like they started to find their form and some of these players started to come online. Saren started to play better. I think the team kind of figured out, oh, if we just put ice on a lot of these hyper carries, then things get a little bit more consistent for us. Trayson, I think, started to come around in terms of his performances, but we knew that wasn't going to be entirely translatable to the playoffs, if only just because I think you can't really hands diff a lot of the players that they're going up against in the same consistent way that you were able to in best of ones, and I think we've seen that relatively consistently. So let's go ahead and talk about what ended up happening. Player of the series should go to one of 2 players here, either Noah or Isma in the jungle. The 2 players that have really been driving the team forward, I would say, throughout a lot of this year and a lot of this split up until this point. June as well in that conversation, but we'll talk about him in just a second. Noah, for me, is going to get player of the series because he was dominating. I mean, this Aphelios was nearly literally untouchable in game number 3. This was as obvious of a stomp as you could possibly get once you get that kind of gold on that hyper carry. Yeah, Noah's going to be able to take over, a player that was in the MVP conversation for me in the regular season. Not somebody that I would necessarily favor for the award because I think he wasn't quite as good down the stretch as maybe he was at the start. But you guys know me. Like, if you followed the channel at all, if you watched the primers, you know, like, Noah and June, like, I'm number one. I'm the number one stan, the number one fan of this bot lane. I think they're top 2 or 3 in the league in terms of the way that they end up playing, and you just need a team around them that can enable them to be able to take over these games. And, you know, once we see him get into a position, Noah in particular, once we see him get into a spot where he can take over in the late game, like, it's unstoppable. He really is that good in that phase, and he can really take over on hyper carries. He's a better version of Ice on the other side of this matchup. So credit to Noah for, I think, showing up, a question we actually had considering the way that this team played in round number 1. To be fair, they had to play Corp, which is obviously a very tough matchup, but nice to see that Noah ends up getting his revenge from that first round matchup. Same thing for Isma, who was not very good in that first round, although he was okay. Certainly wasn't the biggest problem, but man, is Poppy just like Omega in game number 3, like Super Saiyan level good against Nefiri, Ari, and Bessa. Like, how do you even ever play against this champion in this particular matchup? Obviously, massive draft gap in favor of GX in terms of the way they end up playing this out. Just a lot of early game pressure from Heretics that they're not going to be able to capitalize on, but Isma still has to go out and play it well. He has to be in the area to be able to stop a lot of the aggressive plays that Heretics are making, and he was in the area. He's been much better across 2026 than he's ever really been before this. I think a lot of the flashes that he showed at the end of 2025 are not coming to fruition, because I think it's fair to say that he's playing better now than he even played at the end of 2025, but are certainly there and more consistent. I think Isma just needed to get out of the SK bubble, as basically everybody did over the past couple of years. I think it's fair to say that June felt a lot better in this series, that there was a pretty massive support gap between these two teams. Of course, June very bad against Busio in round number 1, somebody who showed way more inconsistency than I expected to see out of him at the end of the regular season, considering he's a player that I've been calling like arguably the best support in the entire region for a pretty long time. He just needs to get comfortable and back into his own form. Again, on his best days, he can be the best support in the region. I don't think anybody's really arguing that. It just needs to come out a little bit more often. Lot was better, Jackie's was better, GX just looked good, and I think overall, this is the version of the team we wanted to see in the playoffs. As for Heretics on the other side, unfortunately, this is the end of their winter split, the end of their run. Kind of expected. I didn't think they were going to win a playoff series. I'm glad they won a game here to at least kind of show that, hey, some of the progress and the positivity that we made in the regular season, it was kind of real. There was a time where we were looking at this team as a pretty clear bottom 4 team that wouldn't even make the playoffs, and so for them to be here and to at least put up a fight, I think is certainly encouraging, but they just didn't have the talent to be able to overcome a GX team that actually was locked in here today. Sten, for me, is going to get dud of the series. This guy's been super feast or famine across this split, and I really use that term literally. Like, the feast version of him is still excellent. He can have those games where he looks like by far the best player on the Rift, but the bad games look really bad, and he had no impact on this series at all. Like, there was genuinely no play that Sten made that was like noticeably good or bad throughout this entire series, which is really frustrating. I shouldn't say that. There were some noticeably bad plays, but overall, just not a good map impact from a support that I think is really important towards Team Heretics' ability to play the map. Same thing for Sheo, who's obviously such a critical piece for Heretics in terms of the way they play. You know, I think the Nefiri in Game 3 was ill-advised. I think that this is a champion that has been nerfed quite a bit and can take over, but certainly not in like a best of 3. I think you're talking like best of 5, Game 5 in terms of champions off the board, and when Nefiri can be a little bit more useful, because there are just a lot of champs that can really shut that down, specifically Poppy Braum, where it's like, uh-oh, I don't know if I can really play the game anymore. That's tough for Sheo. But when Sheo and Stend aren't able to affect the map, things get very, very tough. I think Saren and Trayson were fine in this series. Trayson has started to feel more comfortable, I guess is the fair way to put it, here at the LEC level. Somebody that I loved in Tier 2. I thought he was the best rookie top laner coming up to the LEC this year. Didn't show that at the beginning of the split. Does feel like he's starting to settle in, but rest of the team not really doing all that much. Ice is really just a product of the setup on this team. He can take over in the late game, but only if Sheo and Stend play well in the early and in the mid game. So for Heretics, they had their identity. They just couldn't really capitalize on it because they didn't quite have the skill in their major positions to be able to outplay GIANTX, who is a genuinely good team, who I think has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt at this point is an interesting team to talk about. We're going to talk about them again in just a little bit when we talk about their lower bracket round 2 matchup that they ended up having. This is a team that's one series away from getting top 4. They were consistently 5th basically all year last year. Every single time there was a clear top 4 and they were the clear number 5. We'll see if they can break those chains and potentially get themselves to that top 4 for the first time. But moving on to our second of the lower bracket round 1 series and our second of our first round of eliminations here in the playoffs. These two teams do not want to be going out in the first round. That I can definitely promise you. It was the number 3 seeded Team Vitality taking on the number 8 seeded Fnatic. and Team Vitality is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. They are going to be moving on to the next round to take on, a bit of a rival for them in Corp, and Fnatic is going to be one of the first teams, the first team, quite frankly, eliminated from the playoffs. I guess technically Heretics was eliminated before them in the day, but Fnatic get a lower placement. They get 8th place because Heretics was a higher seed. They were the worst team in the playoffs in terms of how this went. They didn't win a single game in the playoffs. The only team to do that. Ridiculous stuff here from Fnatic. I mean, there's nothing else to say. This team is completely lost right now in terms of the way that they're playing the map and overall their synergy as a team, which is something I'm definitely going to talk about. It feels like every single player is playing the worst that they can at the current moment, but for Vitality, this is a massive, massive victory. Obviously, getting yourself into that next round is huge, but getting that confidence to really move on and start to feel like, okay, maybe we can actually make the run. Vitality is a team that really, thrives is the word I'm looking for, off of momentum and off of like the heat check, if you will. Like, I don't have a better term for it. Really, they're just one of these teams where if they're playing well, they can beat anybody. They are the definition of on any given day. And so exciting to see them generate that momentum and generate that confidence in this particular matchup. Player of the series is obviously going to Nako. This guy is breaking out. I mean, again, like I've had a lot of right takes at the beginning of this year. In fact, we've been doing some calculations, as I always do, because I'm just curious. This has been my most successful year from a preseason primer perspective, maybe ever, since I've started the channel. But one take I got wrong, and this is where I'm also happy. I'm happy to admit where I'm wrong, was Nako. I was like, I just don't know if sophomore year is going to be the year for him to figure it out. I don't know if this team is the one that's going to allow him, is the team that's going to allow him to dominate in the same way that, the comparison I made, which was a very, I think apt one for me, at least in terms of circumstance, was Quid on 100 Thieves with Double Lift and with Closer and, with these players that were really, kind of centralizing in terms of the way they play. I was like, Nako's good, but he's not going to get resources on a team with Humanoid and Karzi, right? Like, he's never going to be the main guy. My bad. Like, I was super wrong about that. This guy is not only breaking out, but he's like making a real case to be the best top laner in the league at the current moment. He really has been that good. The Gnar, the Cassante, his ability to take over in and out of lane, his mechanics, his understanding and awareness in team fights, which has gotten a ton better. That was his biggest weakness last year. I mean, it's really, really great stuff. I really love the way that this guy is playing. He's dominating a lot of competition. Top lane, generally a pretty weak role right now in the LEC, which is, kind of to be expected. A lot of rookies coming up. Nako is feasting on players like Imperos and really kind of capitalizing and becoming one of the best players in the entire league. Really happy to have been wrong about Nako because he is as advertised by a lot of other people. People were telling me, hey man, you're low on Nako. You were right. Yeah, I'm happy to eat the L on that one because it's really been fun to watch him. Of course, same thing for Linsauce. I think this is kind of the opposite. I was a bit of a defender of Linsauce going into the year. Not that I was like fully on board, and I'm still not fully on board. This guy was awful in round number 1. He really needed to be better against Movistar KOI. That was a matchup that Linsauce needed to be more consistent in, and he just wasn't. But the good games from him still look very good. I think he's the best of that like middle cluster of junglers where when he wins, he just wins super efficiently, and he can be a very effective player. He's just not consistent. And, that's the LEC. Like, he's been better than Razork. I don't think that's really a big question. He completely gapped Razork in this series in terms of how jungle went. Top and jungle were massive gaps in favor of Vitality, and if that's going to be the case, it's going to be hard for Fnatic to be able to recover from that. Humanoid had a massive Azir shuffle in game number 1. Beautiful stuff from him. It's very, very funny, and we'll talk about this more. Fnatic gets knocked out of the playoffs by Poby and Humanoid. Very apropos. Like, there's just no other way to say that other than that it's poetic and that it's just the way that esports goes sometimes. Karzi and Fleshy were fine. Karzi made a couple of pretty big mistakes in terms of his positioning in this series, but it never really ended up mattering for Vitality. Fnatic was trying to capitalize on the bottom side because Upset and Vladi were super fed. Vitality's top side was just too strong. So credit to Vitality. They move on now. Very interesting to see what their matchup against Corp looks like, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. And then for Fnatic, as we talk about them, I'm not going to sit here and like lambast this team. I understand that they're going through a bit of a rebuild project right now because, you kind of needed to. I think it still is the right call to bring in players like Luspa and Imperos and kind of hope and pray that they can turn into something. And maybe they're not day number 1, but maybe they do end up getting there. I understand the idea. Luspa, I think, has been pretty good for this team. I certainly haven't seen a lot of negative traits from him. He was really good in the regular season. He's been worse throughout the back end, but I think that's just because they're going up against better teams now, and it's easier to exploit a rookie support when the rest of the team's not playing well. But truly, the biggest biggest problem for me right now, other than the fact that Imperios might be the worst top laner in the league, because we're hoping that that ends up developing and changing, is that Razork is just bad. Like, he is just bad. Like, there's no defending the process at all right now with Razork. He is done in the series, and the frustrating part is that it doesn't really feel like it's just a Fnatic problem, right? It feels like Razork is creating the Fnatic problem in terms of how things are going down. Like I said with the process thing earlier, it's one of those things to sit there and say, okay, Razork's on a bad team and it's not performing well. You would hope and pray that you can put him in a different situation or get the morale up somewhere else and things can kind of adjust themselves. But when I watch Razork play, he's making bad decisions. He's going in at wrong times. He is pathing in weird ways. He's making weird decisions in terms of where he wants to allocate resources. It just doesn't feel like he is comfortable right now. And I don't really know what that is. Like, it feels like the mental, like, decision-making, the process for him is just kind of wrong at the moment. And I don't know how you fix that. Razork has never really been a player that's excelled in that part of the game. He has always been somebody that really wants to generate a gold lead early and snowball it out of control when he doesn't have a gold lead. He's never been an efficient player. That's always been the criticism of Razork, is that he, is really good at generating those early leads, but he kind of needs those early leads in order to be an MVP caliber player. Right now, not only is he not getting those early leads, he's not even knowing where to look to get those early leads, and that's super frustrating. The Nocturne, the Jarvan, it was bad. Linsauce completely gapped him in the jungle. And if that's going to be the case for this Fnatic team, if Razork is just going to be a jungler that's like bottom half in terms of his production, they're going to be like a bottom, 5 team in the league. Like, they don't have anyone else that's going to be able to bring them up consistency-wise. I like Upset as a player, but the players I've always compared Upset to are players like Sven, players like Teddy, players like Aiming over in the LCK, where it's like, you're good if you're able to generate a lead and if the team around you is good, but you can't be the best player on a team. You have to have a team around you because you're not aggressive enough to generate those leads and to dominate games on your own. It's not the same as someone like Carzzy on the other side. They're basically opposite in terms of their playstyles, where Carzzy is going to either win or lose you the game. Upset is basically an extension of the direction that his team is heading in. He's still playing fine. His KDAs look very good, but he's not affecting games in the same kind of way because he doesn't have any setup to be able to affect a lot of these games. Vladi actually played well in this series, but Humanoid was probably better in the big moments, which really ended up mattering. And Imperios, like I said, is probably the worst top laner in the league right now in terms of his actual production. He has been as bad as you could ever have hoped for Fnatic. I really liked his tier 2 tape. I thought he was going to struggle day number 1, but he has like really, really struggled in terms of the way he's playing lane. He cannot survive right now against a lot of even the mediocre top laners. Knock Knock was not a mediocre top laner, and that's why it was such a big gap in this series. Fnatic definitely look like a team that are going to need some time in order to get comfortable, and that is definitely frustrating for Fnatic fans. We'll see how things end up playing out if this team ends up making changes. Their synergy is completely off. It feels like the vibe and the morale around this organization is kind of cooked right now. Hopefully they can figure things out. People want Fnatic to be good, and I think they still can be, but this is a big, big, big win for Vitality to move on to the next round. Obviously, anything else after this point is house money. If you're not a top 4 team, it's really hard to get into the top 4, but being the number 3 seed, being in a position where on any given day they can probably beat anybody, you have to watch out for a team that is one of the more mechanically talented ones in the entire league. But now moving on to our lower bracket round 2 matchups. And again, these are the teams that lost in upper bracket round 2, taking on the teams that just won in lower bracket round number 1. So we've got some really intriguing matchups. Losers are done. The winners move on to Barcelona and have a shot at top 1 still. It's the number 2 seeded Na'Vi taking on the number 5 seeded GIANTX in our first matchup. And GIANTX is going to pull off a little bit of an upset here and pick up the 2-1 series victory. This is obviously massive for GX. This is the hurdle that they have been unable to overcome over the past couple of years, the really last year, in terms of them getting 5th in all 3 splits. It was really frustrating for them to be so close to being competitive and just not quite being there in terms of getting into the top 4 no longer. Na'Vi, a team that looked pretty clear-cut top 4 throughout a lot of this split, ends up getting taken down and really kind of exposed in terms of some of their weaknesses in this series, and GX end up taking it. You just got to be excited for this team. I think they did a lot of things right in this series. I think that there were a couple of players that I was really impressed by, a couple of players that I think needed to lock in a bit more that might not even be all that obvious in terms of the KDAs in this series. But overall, for GIANTX to have won this series, to have overcome some of the expectations that people had for them going into this tournament, it's already such a massive success for GX. We'll talk about it here. Player of the series for me is going to Isma. You want to talk about overachieving and finally starting to figure things out. Isma is coming to fruition in terms of the prospect status that he had when he came onto SK Gaming, and when this guy, really came through. He wasn't the biggest prospect in the world. There was some questions about whether or not he was going to be good day number 1 in the LEC. He had that fantastic winter split for SK with him and with Exa on that team, like they were, overperforming in the winter split. Isma was kind of the level 3 king. This guy was ganking at level 3 every single game and getting a kill every single game, and then he just never really was able to return to that form. Things kind of got worse in spring and summer, and then obviously the couple of years after that just never really felt like they clicked. Something happened when he left SK last year and came over to GIANTX as the starting jungler, where things got a lot better for him, and he started to feel more comfortable in the mid game, something he had never really looked comfortable in before, but it's completely unlocked this year. That's the thing about Isma. He was always kind of projected to be this snowball jungler, kind of like what we've talked about with someone like Razork, where if he wins in the early game, things are going to look good, and if he doesn't win in the early game, he's just like not a player. He's like not on the Rift. He has started to become a much better mid to late game player, and I think that has been the development that has kept him out of these big conversations, so I'm really happy for him. He was probably the better jungler in this series, although Relich was really good on the side of Navi. Both of these junglers I thought played really well. Here today, Isma, I think, just had a little bit more of an impact on the series as a whole, and that probably was the difference maker for GX in Game 3 and in Game 2 as well. As for the rest of the team, Noah and Lot are the other two players that I really want to shout out. Lot was absolutely better than Mainter. Really interesting to see two players that I think are pretty similar in terms of style have to play very differently in this series. Lot, obviously somebody who was kind of known for being a bit more of a weak side king last year when he was just asked to do that. A lot of the time he wasn't really that good on strong side, and so he was playing things like Cassante and Ornn really consistently. We saw that again in terms of winning in this series. And then Mainter, somebody who's exclusively been weak side. We'll talk about him in this series as well. He finally gets to play strong side in game number 3 and does not look very good in that role. So definitely something we will bring up. Lot was the better top laner here. Noah continues to just be super consistent both in and out of lane. He just does everything at a relatively good level. He's not a superstar in terms of the early game. He is a superstar in the late game, but he's a good enough early game player that you can rely on him to generate leads in good matchups. And, with June obviously being a really great laner, I think it all kind of comes together for them. The only big negative I have for GX here is that June was a little bit too far forward in a couple of instances, mostly on the Nico in game number 1, where things weren't all that perfect. Even on the Nautilus in game number 3, I think things could have been a bit more stable, but Jackie's KDA is a complete lie. This guy got so outplayed by Poby. There was definitely a better mid laner in this series, and it was not on the winning team. Jackie's is somebody that I think has just never really been able to recapture what is effectively one good split. And that's what I was saying. I hate to be like a broken record in terms of talking about this, but I just find it so absurd that guy won Rookie of the Year. It still kind of makes me mad. I'm going to be entirely honest with you because, yeah, you won Rookie of the Year because you were good in one split. You were good in summer. Are we not going to talk about the fact that he wasn't good in winter and spring of that exact year, and you're calling the award Rookie of the Year when you have Supa and Alvaro in the LEC in the same year being rookies? It just felt kind of insane to me that Jackie's ended up winning that award, and I think he's kind of proven that he really was a bit of a one-split wonder. He reminds me so much of VTO, but VTO's prime was significantly longer than Jackie's. VTO won an MVP in terms of what he looked like at his absolute best on Misfits. Jackie's never reached that kind of high, and also he didn't do it nearly as long. It's really frustrating. Like, I don't know. I'm pretty out on Jackie's with the process. It just doesn't really feel like he is that good of a player. At best, I think he can be like a mid-table mid laner, but I don't think he's ever going to be better than that. Maybe that's too harsh, but GX are able to win without a good mid laner, which is, kind of astounding. And Jackie's wasn't like running it or anything. He just wasn't generating any leads, and he was giving over resources for free to a Navi team that was desperate to get any resources on the map. That being said, jungle, bot lane, they were really good. Top lane was really good in this series for GX, and if you're good basically everywhere else, then things are going to be just fine, and this team has now punched their ticket to Barcelona. And then for Navi on the other side, this has to be a bit of a disappointment. This team expected top 4 after the regular season, and after their win over Fnatic in round number 1, they looked so dominant in that series, and even in this one, they come out and Relich and Poby look fantastic as a mid-jungle duo. Both of them, I think, make a ton of really positive plays on the map. I think they're, actively pushing the game forward. I think Paris was okay in this series. Didn't really have a lot of opportunities to affect the map because he's playing Enchanters down the stretch of the series, but I don't think he was making mistakes, and I think he did a good job of trying to keep SamD alive. SamD was the target on a lot of these fights, and unfortunately was just not really able to survive. He's not a superstar AD carry, and I think that really ended up coming back to bite them. Not that it really mattered in this series, but perhaps if he had a bit more gold, things could have definitely been a bit different, especially in game number 2. Really, though, the biggest problem was Mainter on the top side. He is the obvious choice for Dead of the series. I don't really think a lot of people are going to be arguing this one. Maybe SamD is going to be the option for some people because he died a ton in this series, but Mainter gets one chance to play strong side in a do-or-die game for Navi in game number 3 on the Rumble, and he looks lost. Like, he looks like he has no idea how to play strong side. This was something I talked about, especially on tape for KCB last year. This was something I really went into depth on in my primer, where it's like, I don't know what Mainter is going to be at the next level because he was never never asked to be like a carry for KCB. He was never asked to be the kind of player that stepped up and actually won them games. He was asked to be stable on the top side, to do okay in lane, to go down a bit of CS because he's getting pressured, and then to just be really good in team fights. I didn't know how that was going to translate to the LEC, and unfortunately what it translates into is a player that really is only good on weak side right now. He is very good on weak side, and I want to make that clear. On the Sion in game number 1, he was really valuable, and we've seen him be very good over the course of this split. But it's clear that he is limited as a player in terms of what he is day number 1. You're hopeful for some improvements, very similar to Lot on the other side, but Lot was better in split number 1 last year than Mainter was, in my opinion, this split. I think they're a relatively fair comparison in terms of players that I think could be, decently similar for their respective teams, but Mainter was just not good enough here today, and that's what ended up separating things for Navi. Still, an incredibly enlightening split for me, for Navi, in terms of the way that things broke down. They are one of the scarier teams in the LEC. Their drafts continue to be pretty innovative and generally have a lot of things going for them. This is one of the Anivia games that I actually don't hate because you're pairing it with something like Jarvan, and I think that makes a lot more sense than pairing it with something like Pantheon, where you can't necessarily roam and fight with him. I think the Jarvan setup is much more consistent for something like Anivia. You just weren't able to find the avenue to make it work in the same kind of way. Navi continues to have a better idea of, I think, what the meta is at than a lot of the other teams do right now, but at the end of the day, GX had better players, and they were able to take advantage of their advantages, of the way that they were able to push forward in this series, and that was more than enough. They finally overcome this top 4 barrier that they have not been able to reach, and they make their way to Barcelona to take on, either KC or Vitality, both teams that I think are going to be a pretty fun matchup for GX. But then moving on to our second of the lower bracket round 2 matchups, and arguably even more interesting than the first. We had 2 of the top 3 seeds, with one of them not being able to make the top 4. It was the 1-seeded K-Corp taking on the 3-seeded Team Vitality. And K-Corp is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They make it look interesting at the start of this series, dropping game number 1, being decently competitive with Vitality in game number 2, but they dominate game number 3, and the narrative is going to be dominated by game number 3. Not just by me, but I think by almost everybody who talks about these games and about this series just in general. People are going to look at the game 3 draft and even really the game 2 draft and just kind of wonder what is going on with Vitality, because this was insane. This felt crazy in terms of Vitality to, in a do or die best of 3 pull out whatever this game 3 draft is. It might be the single worst draft I've seen globally all year long. You guys know me. I'm pretty vocal on this channel, not so much in the big 2026, but I've been super vocal in past years about how draft is super overrated, and I continue to believe that. I do think that draft is overrated. I think that there are bad picks, and I think there's bad synergy, but at the end of the day, if you are the better team and you execute better, almost any draft has a win condition. Like, it has a way it can win the game if you execute on it, identify it correctly, and play towards it. But I think there are little exceptions, and while you could generously make the argument that Vitality's team has a win condition, what are you supposed to do in game number 3 if you're Team Vitality? Like, how are you ever supposed to play this game out? You have 0 damage, you have 0 pressure, you're playing Twisted Fate with 3 losing lanes, you have a Xin Zhao who just kind of has to sit there and not fight anybody because he has no combat power early on in the game, with Seraphine Braum, with Cassante, with Twisted Fate. Like, what is this supposed to do? I just don't understand the idea, the identity behind it. I actually genuinely am confused as to what they wanted to get out of this. Like, typically when I complain about a draft, like, if you've been around the channel, when you hear me complain about, like, oh, Pantheon and Nivea as a duo, or earlier when I said, oh, Mundo Misfortune kind of pairing up, it's like, okay, these champions want to do different things, and that makes it more difficult to play towards both of them because you kind of want a more synergistic comp, but you can still pull off one or even both of those things if you just outplay your opponent. In the Misfortune, Mundo case, if MF just wins lane, and if Mundo can scale into the late game, it doesn't matter, right? The bullet times are still going to hurt, and Mundo's still going to be unkillable. In the Anivia Pantheon, thing that I complain about all the time, at the very least, if Anivia is going to get gold in the solo lane against Ryze and be able to stop the roaming, Pantheon can kind of target that mid lane. There is a world where things end up working out. What is the goal for the draft in game 3? Sorry, I'm off on a tangent, but I just don't really understand. So we'll get into it. That's kind of the rant aside. That's the main part here. We'll talk about it more when we get to Vitality, but let's talk about K-Corp first and foremost. Player of the series for me is going to Yike in the jungle. He's been very good this split. I do think his impact on this team has been a bit overstated, and I know that may not be the most popular opinion in the world, and it's kind of rich coming from the guy who was really adamant that Yike was the best jungler in the league going into the year, where I was like, he's number one for me. I would take him over Elyoya. I would take him over Skumond. Like, I took him over Razork, who at the time was in that conversation, certainly isn't anymore. Like, Yike to me was the number one jungler in the league coming into the year. I think he's been very good. I don't think he's been the best jungler in the LEC. I think Elyoya has been better than him. I think Skumond has probably been better than him as well. I think he has been very, very good, but I think because K-Corp is often winning in a lot of situations, especially in the mid lane, you know, he often gets a lot more of an easy pass. This was one of the series where I can really point to and say, like, okay, Yike actively made the difference in this series. Like, he was the most relevant player on the Rift in terms of creation and follow-through, and this is what you get with Yike when you get to play things like Jarvan and Wukong. These more, I don't want to say straightforward, but these champions that are going to be a bit more aggressive in the way that they want to play. Like, Vi kind of falls into this scenario as well. He is somebody who definitely wants to be more of a, you know, a play starter rather than somebody who just kind of follows through. I don't think things like Mundo are going to be up his alley in terms of the way he likes to play the game. I really like when he has agency and when he can really move around the map and be the one that, you know, chooses when these fights happen. I think that's always when he's going to be at his most comfortable, and that's what we saw here. Again, I'm not trying to take anything away from Yike by saying that I think players like Busio and Yehu have been better for K-Corp throughout this split, but I am trying to say that he stepped up big in a series they really needed him in, and obviously kind of dominated the back end here on the Wukong. So credit to him. Busio continues to be very good. I'm not trying to take away from him. He's been excellent throughout this split, the best support in the LEC right now. He's not been hyper consistent as we saw against G2 because things just didn't work out even on his signature Bard in that series, but people forget, like, he's also a bit of a Nico Rakan main as well. Like, this guy is a, you know, 3 champion superstar. He can play everything. The Alistar has looked great this split. You know, the Engagers have always looked good. He can play Enchanters. He's a former mid lane player, which I think a lot of people forget about. But the Nico he was like really a big proponent of the Nico Rakan Bard trio, the playmaking trio, as I talked about a lot last year, was a big reason why FlyQuest was so successful. And we saw more of that in this series, specifically on the Rakan in game number 2. Kana and Kalista, I think, were also solid. Yehu had some moments. He was able to generate some gold, but was also overextended in a lot of situations where he probably didn't need to be. He was really bad in game 1 on the Taliyah, but he ended up solving and kind of fixing himself and getting back into a better spot to allow K-Corp to be able to pick up the win here. They were basically given a free pass in game number 3 with a win, but they at least get themselves into the top 4 and avoid what would likely be a massive disaster scenario for this team if they ended up in 5th place. That would have just been a nightmare for K-Corp walking out of the regular season as the number 1 team. But as for Vitality, like, obviously this is still a fine result. Going out in 5th, 6th, I don't think is like bad for Vitality in an isolated sense, where I think that is about where they're at in terms of their skill level. Being on the same tier as a team like Na'Vi, I think is fair to talk about for Vitality. Maybe they're a bit more inconsistent than teams like GIANTX and Vitality, but they're very much, or GIANTX and Na'Vi, but they're very much in that conversation. The fact that they were able to take a game off of K-Corp is obviously excellent. Carzzy was incredible on that Ezreal in game number 1, which is really, really cool to see. He can have those feast or famine moments, but again, it all just really comes back to what are we doing here? It's Yasuo in game 2. It's no damage and no side laning and no early pressure and no late game in game number 3, which is tough. Like, that is a tough combination of things to talk about for a draft. It just feels like self-inflicted wounds here for Vitality that I don't really understand, if I'm being entirely honest. And, you know, obviously there were some misplays. We'll talk about Knock here, who is going to be my dud of the series. I still love Knock, and I think he's playing really well. He was not good in this series. The Yasuo was a big problem in game number 2 because they couldn't really generate any sort of consistent pressure for it on the top side. The Cassante obviously wasn't very good in game 3, but he was even kind of bad on their Mbessa win in game number 1. He was inting and kind of running it down at times in that first game. He just wasn't very good in this series, but how much of that do you chalk up to the fact that this guy's playing Yasuo and then Cassante with no damage in terms of like game number 3? This is a really hard series to play out as a top laner, and I think they just put him in a bad position. He may have, you know, called this topside draft. I don't know, right? Like, I don't know if he's calling for Yasuo. I don't know if he's calling for Cassante over something like Gwen in that particular matchup, or even, I hate Kennen, but like anything else on the top side, anything that can win lane and play strong side would have been preferable on the top side going into the Rumble. It's just always going to be tough here, and Knock, I think, was the, you know, kind of obvious standout in terms of who benefited the least from the bad drafts here for Vitality. I think Humanoid was also in that conversation. This Twisted Fate was completely useless in game 3. Carzzy was excellent in game 1, but was disastrous in games 2 and 3 on the Corki and the Seraphine. I think he's not going to get nearly enough credit for being bad in game number 2 and really costing them that game in terms of his positioning. Linsauce had no pressure going into Yike. Fleshy obviously wasn't the biggest problem, but he offered no solutions to a lot of these problems. Like, Vitality weren't good in this series, but how can I even put it on them? This is an unwinnable game in game number 3, and to me, that is the takeaway. If there's anything positive, it's that Vitality was pushing K-Corp when they were drafting normally, and that could be something that you're looking at going into next split and feeling relatively good and comfortable about. But at the end of the day, Vitality, I think, had a real shot to move on to top 4 here to take down the number 1 seed in K-Corp, and they just couldn't capitalize on it, unfortunately. That means they are sent home in 6th place overall for the split, which again, I think is about where they stand in terms of my power rankings. But for K-Corp, they dodge a bullet, they survive, and they move on to Barcelona. They move on to the top 4. It would have been a nightmare for this organization if they once again failed to make it to a massive stage in the playoffs, but at the very least, they're going to have a chance to continue their run. They stay alive. They take on GIANTX, who they've already beaten in the playoffs in the next round. Obviously, that's very winnable for K-Corp. This is a team and an org that expects themselves to get first, very similar to Movistar KOI and G2. They are in that top 3. They need to go out and continue to prove it because the last couple of series have not necessarily been what you want out of K-Corp, but at the very least, they get themselves in a position to be better moving into the final stretch. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the video, and arguably the most important series of the video because it's winners finals. The winner of this series guarantees themselves a spot in the LEC versus finals, giving them 1 series to win to not only become LEC champions for the winter split, but to represent the region at the First Stand International Tournament. The loser, of course, goes down to lower bracket finals, which is definitely still an accomplishment, but it's our first best of 5 all year long in the LEC between the number 6 seeded Movistar KOI and the number 7 seeded G2 Esports. And G2 is going to pick up the 3-0 clean sweep in this one to punch their ticket to the grand finals. And once again, it's G2 just figuring it out when it matters the most. This team just barely above 500 in best of ones in the regular season, 7-0 in terms of games so far in the playoffs. 2-0 in round 1, 2-0 in round 2, 3-0 in round 3. Absolutely ridiculous that G2 has turned around their form in this kind of way. There's jokes online about, oh, I can't believe it, the 7 seed miracle moving on to the finals. What an underdog run. And obviously it's very funny because it's G2, but like genuinely, this team feels like a completely different beast right now than anything they felt like in the regular season. It genuinely feels like a different version of G2, which is exciting for G2 fans and for the LEC. I'll talk about some concerns I still do have, but man, like when they turn it on, when it works, it looks fantastic. For Movistar KOI, this is super disappointing, obviously, not just because you really felt like you were probably the best team in the league heading into this series, but because I think you expect yourselves to be the best team in the league. And for you to not win a single game in a series like this, like that's embarrassing. It's a bit disappointing for Movistar KOI, and they're going to have to rebound, you know, in Barcelona. You know, they're going to be a pretty big crowd favorite, and, you know, it's certainly not looking easy for them to be able to, you know, go and win another championship just like they did in spring of last year. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is obviously Skewmond. I mean, what a performance from Skew in this series. And this is where I do want to talk about like the parallels and the similarities between regular season G2 and playoff G2, where at the core, like at the end of the day, like, are there some things different? Absolutely. I think their mid-game decisiveness is significantly better than it was in the regular season. They were lost on the map. Like, they were truly one of the worst macro teams in the league in the regular season. It just felt like they had no idea what they were supposed to be doing. That has changed, and obviously Broken Blade is playing a ton better on the top side. I think Hans and Labrov have stabilized a bit on the bottom side, even if they're still not like focal points for the way that this team wants to play the game. But what has stayed the same is that the way that G2 win is through the middle of the map. It's through Skewmon and it's through Caps, and that has not changed. That will not change for G2. They are the main characters for this roster. And if they play great, they're going to be able to dominate. Skewmond, when he gets to be comfortable, looks like the best jungler in the league. I think Elyoya and Skew are the two best junglers. I think Yike is in that conversation. I certainly don't want to take him out of that. I think they are clearly the 3 best junglers, but I think Skew has a really strong argument for maybe even being number 1 on that list right now. As a former Skewmon doubter and a former Skewmon hater, one of the things I really held against him was the fact that he wasn't consistent. In the early game, he wasn't really a snowballer. He was somebody who was just super, super reliable in the back end of games. He was a great team fighter. He was a very secure objective controller, and really he wanted to play a slower game, and if you could pull that off, he could be really reliable and valuable in those instances. He has sped up his game considerably from last year in terms of the consistency in the early game, and it's allowed this team to be a lot more aggressive in the fights that they do want to look for, and I think it's really benefiting not only the rest of the team, but it's benefiting him as well. He's allowed to be like better than his opponent now. Last year, it didn't really feel like, even if Skewmon was better than the jungler he was going into, he didn't really have a lot of opportunities to showcase that or show it off because his style style was just very slow and methodical. You reminded me a ton of Xmithy, and that's a very weird comparison, but I do think it was an apt one last year. I think Skewmont has developed into a much more complete player going into 2026, and I think he has been the best player for G2 across the year up until this point. He was incredible in this series. He just gapped Elyoya. Elyoya was fine, probably the best player on KOI in this series, but he wasn't good enough. Skewmont was absolutely better in terms of tempoing this game out of control, and he's making a case to be the best player not only on G2, but maybe in the LEC in terms of raw performance, because this guy has like ridiculous responsibility on this team. Broken Blade's been better in lane. Hansama and Labrav have been able to stabilize on the bot side, like I said, especially in that game number 3. Game number 2 as well, don't want to take that away from them, but this is a team that either functions, they either win or lose like these major games because of Skewmont and Caps, and for a player like Skewmont to have that responsibility and to step up and really corral it, like, it's awesome to see. Very happy for him. Caps was also great here. Hans was really good in the late game, and I think that that is something that I'm really going to be keeping an eye on when it comes to Hansama, because one of the big reasons why I'm just so out on this bot lane is because it feels like a conflicting playstyle. I've talked about this a lot on the channel, where Labrav is really at his best when he gets to play a bit slower and play more for team fights, because he's not really all that good at taking 2v2 skirmishes. On the bottom side, he's not really a good objective fighter when he's not playing team fights and finding flank angles. Hansama, a player who has always been known for his ability to generate resources at a really high clip, not somebody who always utilizes those resources at a high level, but because he's been so good at generating them, he often just has advantages that other players aren't going to have. It felt like a conflicting style in terms of the way they wanted to play the game. One thing I'm really looking out for with Hans is, can he just be better in the late game? Can this guy actually turn into somebody that can be reliable as a weak side AD carry that can go and play mid to late game fights at a high level, even if he's not expected to be able to dominate laning phase? In this series, he was that, and that is encouraging, right? Like, it's something he just never has been consistently throughout his career. I think that is the role that he's going to have to fill on this team, because they need to play for Caps in the early game. They really don't have a lot of other options. Labrav obviously playing things like Bard in this series, moving around the map and opening things up. They've been playing a lot more of that across this split. It means that Hans is likely going to have to be isolated more than he normally has been throughout his career on this G2 team. At least in this series, it looked better than it has in the past, and that, again, is going to be something I'm monitoring. If Broken Blade only dies 3 times, you're probably in a good spot. This guy's been horrendous throughout this year, and he's been really good in the playoffs. You just have to hope that that turnaround is going to be legitimate. And again, you know, Labrav was also very good on the Bard in particular in that first game. So G2 just looking super solid. I still think they have a lot of things they need to work on, and they are a particular team because they are so middle of the map focused, but at the end of the day, it might not matter that they're so middle of the map focused if they're just going to win through that phase of the game every single time they play an LEC team. But then for Movistar KOI on the other side, kind of goes back to what we were talking about a bit earlier with them, where it's like, it's either Jojo Pune or bust for MKOI. This is the same conversation we had last year for this team, where he either has so much pressure in the middle of the map that Elyoya can play super aggro, and that Supa and Alvaro can start to step up and be a little bit more aggressive with the way that they want to take trades, or they don't, and the rest of the team just kind of crumbles around him. Like, Jojo to me was bad in this series, specifically on the Cassiopeia in game number 3, where he's going to get dead of the series. Like, I just don't think he was good enough here today. I think he misplayed a lot of the laning phases. He overstepped and was getting caught out in situations where he had no business being that far forward against a comp of Wukong and Ahri that have so much pick potential on your low mobility mid laner here. It just felt like he was making a ton of mistakes, and he wasn't very good in game 1 on the Galio either, a champion he's historically struggled on in terms of both North America and Europe. So definitely frustrating to see that, because again, he is kind of like the Skewmon for Movistar KOI, where he's either pushing the game forward or the game is stagnating for the team. As much as I like the other players, and I do think Elyoya can push the game forward, Jojo is so polarizing as a player in the mid lane, and this team plays around him so much that it just becomes so much more difficult for them to win games. Alvaro and Supa were also really bad in this series, and I think that that ends up being a big problem. These were players that I was praising for being great in some playoff runs in the past. That did not come through in this series. Alvaro made a ton of mistakes throughout this one, especially on the Seraphine in game number 2, and Supa was arguably just as bad on the Caitlyn and wasn't very good on the Corki either. You could definitely give Supa dead of the series or Alvaro dead of the series, and I'm really not going to be all that upset by that. Mirwin was just kind of on his lonesome on the top side. He couldn't really take advantage of Broken Blade. This is always going to be a matchup that favors G2 just because of the playstyle of these two players. Again, I think Elyoya was the only one even generating resources, and he still was out-jungled in terms of his own individual position. So I don't really know what to feel about Movistar KOI. Again, they're also a very specific and a very specialized team in terms of the way that they play the game, because they need Jojo to win lane. They need him to move around the map and to be able to, you know, create advantages by shoving and roaming. Outside of that, they're good players, but that is the style that Movistar KOI plays. And so when you take that away, it becomes more difficult. And now they're going down to the lower bracket. They've used that extra life. They're guaranteed top 3, but, you know, they're going to have to take on one of GIANTX or Corp, which are two difficult matchups in the lower bracket finals. And even if they win that, they have to beat G2 in the finals to represent their region, you know, like we kind of thought they would throughout a lot of the regular season. It's definitely frustrating for KOI, but it's huge for G2, who continue to assert their dominance over the LEC as a region. I may have my problems with the way that this team plays and the specificity with which they need to win, but at the end of the day, whatever works, works. It might not be the most consistent internationally at all times, but it certainly is something that consistently gets them success in the LEC, and we just see it over and over again, especially with how good Skewbon's playing. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC versus Round 2 playoff overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated bracket. We know our 4 teams that are heading to Spain, to Barcelona for the top 4 here. We know the order that they're going to be going in. Some roads are much easier than others, and we can kind of preview where they stand. Of course, G2 winning winners finals gets themselves immediately into the grand finals for LEC versus. They have to win 1 series to move on to first stand. Movistar KOI move down to that lower bracket final where they will meet the winner of GIANTX and Corp. Now, these 2 teams did play in the first round. They played in the final week of the regular season as well, so we have a pretty good understanding of where they end up landing, and Corp certainly looks pretty favorited in that regard. But again, KC, a team that has consistently not looked at their best in these major best-of series in the playoffs. You have to imagine that they're going to be a little bit more shaky than maybe they were in round number 1. Still, I think they've proven more than enough to say that they should be able to take down GIANTX and move their way on to the lower bracket finals. Now, as for Movistar KOI taking on Corp, that to me is the intriguing matchup. Whoever wins that, I think, is going to be really, really telling for where the LEC sits. G2 are definitely still favorites in the LEC right now, but I think if Corp can take down Movistar KOI, they're the one team that I think has the potential to be well-rounded as a unit because of all 5 of their players, where I think teams like G2 and KOI kind of rely on their way of playing the game in order to win. I still think they haven't really gotten it down. Corp, at their best, should be the best team in the league, but definitely still a lot to prove in that regard. For now, I'm predicting Corp to win both against GIANTX and against Movistar KOI. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that takedown in the comments section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering every single series throughout the rest of the playoffs and first stand on this channel, as we always do. As we get into the semifinals and the finals, we're going to start doing game-by-game breakdowns as well instead of the series-by-series breakdowns. So we'll be going even more in-depth than we did in today's video. And of course, we cover 3 other major regions as well: LCS, LCK, and LPL every single week on this channel, and the playoffs that are happening for them in that same vein. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all